A warm welcome to everybody. Repeating Chloe's welcome to the annual Butterfly Recorders meeting. It's a real pleasure to see. I've not managed to dip into the chat yet, but to see so many people joining and from across the UK and further afield. And like you, I'm looking forward to today's programme. So whether you're a long-standing expert or you've come to butterfly recording more recently, there's plenty in this meeting for you. Butterflies are amongst our most beloved wildlife. I always remember how a lady in our local post office was thrilled and told me all about seeing her first red admiral of the year. And she said, because there's not many of them around anymore. So many people clearly understand the plight of our butterflies. And it's the work that many of you do as recorders that enables us to get that message out there. Without your dedication, patience, and expertise, we simply wouldn't know what's happening to butterfly populations across the UK. Your records form the backbone of butterfly recording schemes, and today's meeting is an opportunity to hear about progress, share learning, and explore how that evidence is shaping nature recovery. It's also a chance to connect research, recording, and real-world impact, linking what you observe on the ground to the bigger picture. And I was really thrilled this week to see a paper published using data largely from North America and Europe that presented the first ever global butterfly index, demonstrating that it's possible to add a group of insects to the Living Planet Index that tracks how global biodiversity is doing. Globally, we're living through a critical time for nature. The evidence is clear that insects are under pressure from planetary changes we are responsible for. Habitat loss, climate change, pollution, land use change, and war. Butterflies are powerful indicators of how nature is responding. When their populations change, they are often telling us something fundamental about the health of ecosystems as a whole. But dealing with the global crisis starts at home. Understanding and engaging with nature where we live is vital. This is where your role as recorders becomes central to nature recovery. Reliable long-term data allows us to move beyond anecdote and assumption. It helps us identify which species are declining, which are recovering, and where conservation impact is having where conservation action is having an impact. Your records shape conservation priorities, influence land management decisions, and support policies aimed at reversing biodiversity loss. Butterfly conservation's role is to advocate for change using that evidence. Turning that evidence into action is critical to that ambition. Data gathered by recorders underpins our state of reports, our species recovery plans, and helps track progress against strategic targets. Butterflies also feature prominently in the government's species abundance target, which focuses on increasing overall populations rather than simply preventing extinctions, though I would wish that the government would pay more attention to its own targets. Nature recovery is not an abstract concept. It happens in real places at local scales, often driven by committed individuals and communities. You as county recorders, verifiers, coordinators, recorders, enthusiasts play a vital role here, acting as experts and advocates. Your knowledge informs planning decisions, guides agri-environment schemes, and helps organisations and landowners target habitat restoration where it can make the greatest difference. Today's agenda reflects the breadth and strength of this work. We'll begin with an update on the butterflies for the new Millennium scheme, highlighting progress, developments, and future priorities. We'll hear about the UKBMS in its 50th year. It was a real privilege back in Nottingham in November to speak at the 50th anniversary celebration, and thank you to all those who led their own local celebrations through the year. There will be an exclusive sharing of the 2025 UKBMS results, and I'll be the first of a number of speakers to remind you that this is an exclusive. Please don't share anything until the official press release goes out in the middle of April. We'll also hear from a range of experts, bringing different perspectives from practical recording, such as using UV light to monitor black hair streaks, insights into the large heath, cutting-edge research, into the dual impacts of nitrogen and heat, and a look at the southern small white, reminding us that climate change will continue to influence our butterfly fauna for decades to come. Before I close, I just want to say a sincere thank you. Recording butterflies takes time, skill, and commitment, often carried out quietly and without public recognition. But the impact of that work is profound. You are providing the evidence base for nature recovery, helping us measure success, learn from failure, and make better decisions for the future of biodiversity. Over the past 12 months, we've seen changes in our biological data team. We've recently recruited Todd Jenkins to cover for Claire while she's on maternity leave, helping with the data backlog. So please keep submitting your records so it is available for all the vital reasons I've already mentioned. Finally, thank you for joining us today. I hope you find the meeting informative, inspiring, and rewarding. And I'm very pleased now to hand you over to another new recruit in the data team this year, Richard Austin, for our first update.
Thank you very much, Russell. And yeah, sorry everyone, I think the chat was disabled at the beginning of the meeting, but now it should be working. So hopefully you can use that. Yeah, I'm Richard Austin and I am the Recording Schemes Officer for BC. And I will now share my screen with you like that. Okay. So welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. As I said, my name is Richard Austin and I want to give you an update this morning about the butterflies for the new Millennium scheme. So firstly, I just want to touch on the changes that have occurred in the team over the past 12 months. For those of you who have attended these meetings in the past few years, you will be familiar with Swaay Randall, who was the Senior Surveys Officer for BC for over 18 years. Swaay left BC in the spring of last year, and I stepped into the role in April. We're all very grateful for Zoe's dedication and to everything she put in place for the lepidoptera community. Les Evans-Hill was also a long-standing member of the team, and last summer Claire Pasquetti stepped into the role as Biological Data Officer, and she's made great progress in understanding the data systems and the county recorder network. So to give you some background about the Butterflies for New Millennium scheme, from 1995 to 1999, Britain and Ireland were completely resurveyed. More than 10,000 volunteers and hundreds of organisations participated, contributing over 1.6 million butterfly sightings. The resulting data formed the basis of a major book, which was the Millennium Atlas of Butterflies in Britain and Ireland. Now, the B&M has continued since then, undertaking back-to-back 5-year surveys of butterfly distributions across the UK, and we have amassed over 12 million sightings. Historical records have also been added. As a result, we can also assess the long-term changes and in distributions of all our UK butterfly species. So I wanted to use this graph to illustrate the increase in butterfly records over the past 10 years. We have seen a consistent increase, which saw a jump in the pandemic, and this really reflects the increase in biological recording throughout that period. But the growth has continued, and highlighted in green here shows that 2025 was really a bumper year for butterfly records in the UK. Whilst more favourable weather conditions are a factor to this, there is strong evidence to show that more people are recording butterflies in the country. So the next slide here, I want to demonstrate when people record butterflies and the type of butterflies that they are seeing at each time of year, going month by month. So this data has been taken from iRecord. I've excluded the UKBMS data, as we'll be discussing that later on today. There is a distinct peak here, obviously, in the summer months. As you can see, the highest quite substantially is in July. And conversely, the lowest numbers obviously recorded in the winter months, January receiving the fewest records. In January and February, it's the brown hairstreak, which is the most recorded butterfly. But this is not as an adult at this time of year. It is recorded by volunteers who undertake egg searches throughout the winter. Now, in March, the brimstone appears more prominently, and this indicates the beginning of spring. In April, we see the orange tip appearing, whilst in May, it's more likely to see the speckled wood. As the year moves into summer, we start to see an increase in recording significantly. Meadow brown was recorded the most in June 2025, the gatekeeper in July, and the small white in August. As we move into autumn, in September, October, and November, the red admiral is the most recorded butterfly at this time of year. In fact, it continues to be the highest recorded adult throughout the winter as well. And the brown hair streak, as in January and February, is the most recorded butterfly in December. So there is some variation across the 4 nations of the UK. Here in Scotland, the top 5 species for 2025 are red admiral, speckled wood, the green Wainwright, peacock, and the small tortoiseshell. Now, the red admiral regularly migrates north to all parts of Scotland and has been even found on St Kilda and Fair Isle. The first wave of immigrants arrive in late March from North Africa, followed by another wave from Spain and Portugal, reaching our shores in May and June. Any later arrivals will probably arrive from further north within Western Europe. Now, looking across to Northern Ireland, here is a slightly different picture. The top 5 species are red admiral, small tortoiseshell, speckled wood, green Wainwright, and small white. The small tortoiseshell is one of the most familiar and widespread species across Northern Ireland, frequently seen in gardens and open countryside. Typically, this butterfly is active between March and October. It is often the first butterfly seen in spring as it emerges from hibernation and can even be spotted during mild winter spells. Now, across into Wales, the top size species here recorded last year were speckled wood, red admiral, large white, small white, and meadow brown. So the speckled wood is a common widespread butterfly across Wales, found in woodland glades, hedgerows, shady gardens, and often seen in dappled light. The speckled wood is on the wing in 2 or 3 broods between the end of March and October. And finally, into England is where we see the whites more prominently. The large white, small white, speckled wood, red admiral, and peacock make up the top 5 for 2025. The large white is a common large white butterfly across England, and it features distinct black tips on its forewings that extend down the wing edge. Females have 2 black spots on each forewing, whilst the males do not. They are found in gardens, allotments, and farmland from April to October. So looking ahead now for the rest of this year, of 2026, we have a plan in place. As I mentioned, Claire Pasquetti stepped into the role as Biological Data Officer, and she went on maternity leave in December. We have now recruited a new Biological Data Support Officer. Todd Jenkins began the role earlier this month, and Claire set out the framework for Todd to follow, and he will be in post for 12 months. Between April and June, Todd will tackle the backlog of imports, support data county recorders, and also any data-related queries and data exchange processes. In July, Claire is planning to return to her role as Biological Data Officer. This will give greater capacity to our team, and it also provides an opportunity to modernise data flows, improve the database structure, and enhance support for our county recorders. Regarding data, there have been some technical and staff changes which have slowed down the process to progress data onto our national databases. But we'd just like to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to everyone who has contributed in both recording and verifying butterfly records. We are extremely grateful as your efforts contribute to the incredible resource that we have. I just want to touch on the Big Butterfly Count for 2025. Here are the headlines from last year. The large white and small white had their best ever results in the Big Butterfly Count and were the most recorded butterflies across all 4 nations of the UK, with the exception of Northern Ireland, where Red Admiral came on top of the list. Unfortunately, the small tortoiseshell continues to be a cause of concern, as these numbers reveal a concerning long-term decline of the species. There was a small recovery in 2025, but overall the species has declined by 60% since 2011. It's better news for the Jersey tiger moth. This species has had a significant increase in both distribution and numbers. It recorded a 174% increase in numbers compared to 2024. These moths last year were photographed in Cardiff, Birmingham, Cambridgeshire, Essex, throughout the big butterfly count period, and more than 20,000 people visited the Jersey tiger moth species page on BC's website last summer. So this is a very charismatic day-flying moth, and actually could be a really great way to connect with the general public and to get a better understand Lepidoptera in general and encourage more recording of Lepidoptera. So to look at the numbers of the big butterfly count, over 125,000 citizen scientists got involved in the big butterfly count, more than ever before. Over 1.7 million butterflies and day-flying moths were recorded, with the top 5 species being large white, small white, gatekeeper, red admiral, and meadow brown. On average, participants recorded 10.3 butterflies during each 15-minute count. Now, whilst this is a marked improvement on the low in 2024, which was just 7.2, this is broadly average by modern standards and has done little to reverse longer-term declines. There are some updates coming for the big butterfly count, which will be announced in due course. But an update I can give now is that the comma is being added to the list for Northern Ireland this year. The dates for your diary for this year is the big butterfly count will run between the 17th of July and the 9th of August. So just to reflect some of the information I've given in a bit of a graph here to illustrate the increase in both participants and counts since the beginning of the scheme. So you can see the participants participants is in blue and the counts are in green, and the scale is on the left-hand side of this graph. So you can see a consistent increase in that, and reflected in the graph both for participants and counts. 2025 was a record year by both metrics. So that's fantastic in terms of increasing participation in the survey. Unfortunately, what is showing more in a decline is the black line on the graph, which is the average number of butterflies and day-flying moths spotted per 15-minute count. So as illustrated there, you can see the record low in 2024. You can see the peaks that we had in 2013 and 2019, and you can see the recovery that occurred in 2025, but it's not as significant as we might have hoped, given that we had such good weather conditions in the period in 2025. So BC are launching a new campaign this spring. So it's called Britain's Favourite Butterfly, and this campaign will celebrate the joy of butterflies and inspire us all to notice butterflies where we live. So you do not need to be an expert or survey butterflies to take part. Anyone can take part. It will launch in May and run for 3 weeks. There will be a dedicated microsite for this campaign with live rankings of the results. This will be paused in the final week, and the vote will be counted, and the results will be announced in June. So we'd love to encourage you all to obviously take part in this new campaign, and also share it widely amongst all of your contacts, as we can sort of increase the awareness of Lepidoptera in the UK, and hopefully encourage more people to record butterflies in the UK. Okay, so that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to everyone on the call today, and everyone recording and verifying butterfly records across the UK and contributing to the butterflies for the new Millennium scheme. Your data is obviously invaluable to us, and we look forward to working with you more in 2026. And hopefully you'll be able to get involved with the big butterfly counts and Britain's Favourite Butterfly surveys happening later this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for kicking us off today. And that was a really nice to see so many of our favourite butterflies, if we can have many favourites, on screen to start us today. And I'm sure that everybody watching is busy thinking about who they're going to vote for in their Britain's favourite butterfly as well. And I just wanted to say that it has been a pleasure to be involved in the metamorphosis of the team, and it's wonderful how the team is now coming back up to full strength and really settling in. So we're enjoying that and catching up to with the really important work that we do with the records that everybody on the call helps us to manage. So I think at this point we will pass on, if that's okay, Richard, to the next talk, because I just wanted to say I'm sorry to anybody who is experiencing audio issues on the call. It's not affecting everyone, and I don't think it's affecting the recording. But if you are experiencing that, please hang on. We're going to see if we can get some advice into the chat or the Q&A for you. It could be, we've had some helpful suggestions. It could be that there's 2 copies of Zoom open that have popped up when you joined the meeting this morning. Meanwhile, and I hope that many of you will be able to hear this because it's going to be fantastic, a lovely summary of the UKBMS from Joe, Milborrow and in Middlebrook. So I will pass you firstly to Joe.
So yeah, my name's Joe Milborrow. I'm the Butterfly Monitoring Officer at Butterfly Conservation. And I helped coordinate the volunteers working on the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. So I'm really pleased to be here to share an update about the UKBMS and the 2025 season. So as a very brief intro, the UKBMS is a partnership scheme run by 4 organisations, Butterfly Conservation, UKCEH, JNCC and the BTO. And it's a structured monitoring scheme following standardised methods, and it produces UK and country level population trends. So I'm going to talk about how the scheme went in 2025, and we've got Marc, who's going to from UKCEH, who's going to talk to us later about the population trends. So that'll be really exciting to hear about. So today I'll give you a quick overview of the UKBMS volunteer network. We'll look at the coverage from 2025, highlight some of the new developments, including new species and monitoring methods, look at some of the things we're working on now, and then I'm going to finish up with a roundup of the 50th anniversary. So 2025 was the 50th survey season for the UKBMS, so it was quite a special year. Before we get into the data, I just wanted to take a moment to say a big thank you to some of our Transect coordinators and wider countryside butterfly survey champions who have stepped down this year. These volunteers help us to coordinate the surveys for their region, and they do a fantastic job supporting the many hundreds of surveyors in their area. And just a special mention to Andy Barker, who's been coordinating the transects across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight for the last 36 years. And he's helped to grow the number of transects in the area from 34 to nearly 200. So it's a brilliant achievement, and we're glad that Andy's staying with us to coordinate one of the regions within Hampshire. And of course, a very warm welcome to all of our new Transect coordinators and WCBS champions who are stepping into those vacant roles, and they'll be working hard over the next few months to support the surveyors in their region. These roles are absolutely vital to keeping the scheme running, so a sincere thank you to all of the current, former and new coordinators and champions for everything that you do. And just a quick note to say that we're always looking for more volunteers to get involved. There's opportunities at the moment to become a Transect coordinator for Cumbria, also for the Isle of Wight and for the West Midlands area. And we also have a vacancy for a wider countryside butterfly survey champion in Kent. As well as those, we've got some adverts out for specific transects or WCBS squares where we need some extra help to survey those sites. So if you or someone you know might be interested in helping, then please do check out Butterfly Conservation's volunteer opportunities pages. And I'll pop a link in the chat to those at the end of my talk, so you can go and have a little nosy during your break. Okay, so we'll look at some of the data from 2025. This chart shows how the UKBMS has grown over the last 50 years, since it began in 1976, when the first 39 transects were monitored. The scheme combines three sort of method groups. The standard transects shown on the chart in red, the wider countryside butterfly survey squares shown in green, and then a group of methods for specific species called targeted methods. They're shown in blue. And we'll have a closer look at each of those in a moment. But as you can see, 2025 was another record year for the UKBMS, with the most transects ever being monitored, a total of 2,627. So big congratulations to everyone involved. And let's make a start with looking at some of the transects. So this map shows all of the transects that were monitored in 2025. And it's great to see so much of the UK covered. Plus, we also have some transects on the Isle of Man and on the Channel Islands. The butterfly conservation branch area with the most transects monitored in 2025 was again East Midlands, who have been at the top of the leaderboard for the last 5 years. So they had 231 transects monitored in 2025. Followed by Hampshire, who were there with just under 200 transects, followed by Surrey, Cambridgeshire and Essex, and then a draw for 5th place with Dorset and Yorkshire. So this map shows all of the new transects that were set up in 2025, and again, quite a spread across the country. You'll spot there's a few clusters, maybe where there's really active coordinators who have got new sites up and running, such as in the East Midlands. So the coordinator in that area, Ken Ork, works really hard to expand the network. And there's also several conservation organisations whose staff set up new transects to monitor the sites or the reserves that they manage. So of note is the team at Epping Forest, where they've been busy monitoring 10 sites, and the team down on the Channel Islands, who have set up a whopping 18 new transects in 2025 on the islands, including the first on Sark, so that's great to see. In total, there were 267 new transects set up in 2025. It's always encouraging to see the network continuing to grow, and this reflects the ongoing enthusiasm and commitment from the volunteers. Okay, so moving on to look at the wider countryside butterfly survey. This slide shows the coverage of the wider countryside butterfly survey, and this survey forms part of the UKBMS and comprises a network of randomly selected 1 kilometre squares, which volunteers survey at least twice in July and August. 2025 was an average year for coverage for the WCBS, with 792 squares monitored. And these are done by both butterfly conservation volunteers and also BTO volunteers who can choose to do additional visits to monitor butterflies on their breeding bird survey square. And it's great to work in partnership with the BTO on this. And their volunteers make a really important contribution to the data set through those surveys. So this map, the darker green areas are ones that have good coverage with 40 or more squares monitored, and the paler areas have fewer squares that were monitored in 2025. So if you're in one of those areas and would like to contribute, then do visit the UKBMS website and get in contact with your local champion, because we'd love to be able to get some of those paler areas shaded in dark green. So together with the transects, this survey of the randomised 1 kilometre squares throughout the UK landscape helps to build a robust data set and to produce the population trends, which Marc's going to talk us through later. So one of the targeted survey methods for specific species that I mentioned earlier is point counts for purple hair streak. This arboreal species is harder to pick up on the standard transects, as it tends to spend much of its time high up in the tree canopy, and also it's a bit more active later in the day and into the evening. So generally, only lower numbers are encountered during standard transects. But we know that it does occur in higher numbers, So an evening point count method was introduced in 2023. So in 2025, purple hair streak was recorded at 410 sites across the UK, but mostly in low numbers. This evening point count method was used at 25 of those sites, so a similar number of sites to previous years. And these accounted for over 68% of the higher counts of 20 or more individuals. So we can see that this method gives us a more reliable understanding of purple hair streak numbers. So we'd like to encourage more people to get involved. It's a great method to take on if you can't commit to a full transect, or maybe you have more commitments during the daytime, as the evening point counts are carried out obviously later on in the day, and they're weekly just from sort of mid-June through to the end of August. You'll find all the information about that on the UKBMS website. We introduced and trialled some new methods in 2025. These help us to better track species that aren't always well covered by the standard transects. So there's a new method for northern brown Argus egg counts was launched in 2025. There's only been a few done so far, but we're keen to expand this and get some more sites monitored. And Patrick, our senior ecologist in Scotland, can help with that and provide support and sort of advice on suitable sites. We also introduced UV light surveys for black hair streak. So this new method was introduced and trialled in 2025. And we hope this will expand the number of sites where black hair streak can be monitored. And we've got Gareth with us today. And he helped to develop and doing some of these surveys. So he'll be talking a bit more about that in a bit. So on to new or newish, not really new species. And it's not often we get to talk about new species in the UK. But one of the exciting developments this year was the first UK record for the southern small white. So that's a species from the continent that's been expanding its range northward. And Chris is going to be talking to us later on this morning about that. The southern small white's yet to be recorded on a UKBMS site. There were a very few casual records made in the east of England, Suffolk and County Durham last summer. We also continue to see occasional records for large tortoiseshell. This species was once resident in the UK but went extinct, but has been breeding intermittently over the last decade or so. It now seems established at a small number of sites in southern England, and it was recorded on 3 transects in 2025. And there's been casual sightings this spring from sites in southern England. Another development this year is the publication of some new guidance that brings together the different butterfly monitoring methods that are available. So this guidance is really useful for local communities or wildlife groups, projects, landscape partnerships that want to get involved in butterfly monitoring or want to set up some butterfly monitoring on their site. It pulls together all the available methods, including those used by the UKBMS and others, and it helps you choose the most appropriate approach for your needs. So that document is available on the UKBMS website and the Butterfly Conservation website, and I'll share a link to that in the chat at the end as well. So another thing we're working on with UKCEH is developing regional trends. So these are kind of at a branch or a county level where there's enough data, and this will allow us to produce kind of more localized insights. So looking at the population trend for each species within each county or branch area. This chart is here as a bit of an example of what the data can reveal for some species at local level. This is the population trend for small tortoiseshell within Dorset. It doesn't tell a very happy story. So this is just shown as an example to highlight we need to review a lot of these. You can see some of the red dots to the left of the chart are where the species was recorded at 5 or fewer sites So we may need to adjust the time period for some of these to produce a robust and reliable trend. So these are all undergoing expert review at the moment, and we hope to be able to share more on the regional analysis over the next year. So 2025 was a special year, as I mentioned at the beginning. It was our 50th anniversary. So there were some events, talks and activities across the UK to celebrate this. So thanks to everyone that got involved. We have a lovely video you can watch celebrating the work of the 3,000 plus volunteers who contribute to the scheme. And we also have another video coming soon from the team in Northern Ireland who've been working on an arts project to celebrate the 50th year. Over the past 50 years, the UKBMS has built an incredible data set. We've completed 4,000 transects, surveyed more than 2,400 wider countryside squares, and carried out over 800 targeted surveys. In total, that's 7,679 sites monitored since 1976, and it gives us an incredible long-term picture of butterfly populations in the UK. The scale of this effort is huge. Across those 50 years, the volunteers have counted 44.4 million butterflies. 11 of the species monitored reached their 1 millionth mark, with Middlebrook being by far and away the most encountered species, accounting for more than a quarter of all sightings, and a total of 12 million Middlebrooks have been counted during the surveys. All of that data comes from an extraordinary amount of fieldwork. At least 1.59 million kilometres have been walked carrying out the surveys. That's almost 1 million miles in old money, or 40 times around the entire planet, 4 trips to the moon. And it really shows the dedication behind this scheme and how much people care about understanding and protecting butterflies. And it's a great reminder of what a volunteer network can achieve. So finally, a huge thank you to everyone who contributes to the UKBMS, both the volunteers and the staff from our partners, whether you're walking a transect, plugging in data, coordinating surveys, crunching the numbers, or supporting us in other ways. Your efforts make all of this possible, so thank you. And finally, from me, I want to say good luck to everyone starting their transects next week. The first week of the 2026 survey season begins on Wednesday, so I'll be keeping my fingers crossed for good weather for you all. Thanks for so much for listening, and I will hand back to Chloe.
Thank you, Jo. That was wonderful to hear about the half-century work that's gone into the UKBMS and continues to have such a big legacy and such a big future for butterflies. Here's to the next 50 years. So thank you for presenting that for us today. There's some wonderful considered chat going on about phenology and the big butterfly count. I'm really enjoying that, lots of different points, and it makes me think maybe next year we should have a big butterfly count phenology talk. Keep the ideas coming, but also to me it just sort of demonstrates why it's so important that we have lots of different ways of generating data so that we can capture different things, allow different people to get involved, and use these different data sets to analyze in different ways. So that being the case, it's a good segue on to Gareth Tilley, who is one of our wonderful volunteers who's going to be talking to us about a particular butterfly and a special monitoring technique. So over to you, Gareth. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for the introduction, and I hope everyone can see the presentation coming up now. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to talk about this UV technique, which I've been really focusing on and looking at over recent years. So I'm doing this as a self-funded PhD for the University of Sussex as well. So, and it's something I've been working on for around 5 years now. So we've covered a lot of this already, and it's good to hear people's perspectives on this, but effectively, why it's important to monitor butterfly conservation. It's not just that we're witnessing trends for butterflies themselves, but they're a really important bioindicator as well. So we can use that as a methodology to look at wider impact of things like climate change, habitat loss, and other things like that. And we've obviously got UKBMS in place and the big count and activities like that to do that longer term trend analysis. There is an issue, though, just with monitoring and recording butterflies, that if you don't look at the whole of a life cycle of an insect, that you might miss out some really important information. So a good example of that is the large blue, where the symbiotic relationship wasn't understood with the caterpillar stage of that species, and that did contribute to the extinction in Britain of that species. So whilst it's great to count adult butterflies, understanding the holistic life cycle is also really important. So why are some species hard to monitor as butterflies? Again, I'm sure a lot of people appreciate this on this talk, on this call, and we've also already heard about the purple hair streak in particular. The butterfly I've been looking at is the black hair streak, and it's present here in Epsom. There's a colony here which I found during lockdown. It's one of those serendipitous moments. In 2020, I found a black hair streak butterfly came across my path, and that led me to start to research the species in a bit more detail and look at the colony here in Epsom in particular. So in terms of the butterfly, again, I'm sure folk are aware, but it's one of our 5 hair streaks, and it's part of that wider family grouping of blues, copper, and hair streaks. And it is one of our species of concern in the UK. And it is in England, it's restricted to what's termed its heartland, which is the kind of heavy clay soils around Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire and Buckinghamshire. But there are 2 colonies known outside that. So that's in Ditchling in Sussex and the one I'm looking at here in Epsom as well. What's interesting about the species is it's actually got a very large distribution. So it's here in England, but it's also spreads all the way to Japan, which is quite remarkable. So why is it so hard to study, and why do we need to look at different techniques to look at this butterfly in particular? So looking at this life cycle, this is from the Butterfly Conservation website. So you can see that the most of the period for this butterfly, for this insect, is spent as an egg. So all the way from July to March, it's an egg. It's a caterpillar between April and May for around kind of six weeks or so, a chrysalis for 2 to 3 weeks, and then it's an adult. It's got a very short flight period as a butterfly, so only 2 to 3 weeks as a butterfly. So the vast majority of time is as an egg. And the eggs are really hard to find. So we've already heard mention of the count done for black hairs, for brown hair streak. Brown hair streak also lay on blackthorn, so they're on the same bush. And I love this quote from Jeremy Thomas. What he says is to find 2 or 3 black hair streaks eggs in an hour is really good going. And you can find 100 brown hair streaks eggs in the same amount of time as searching. I mean, personally, looking for black hair streak eggs in Epsom, I've only ever found one in quite a few years now of looking. They are really hard to find. And the reason for that is people know this on this call. Brown hair streak eggs are white, black hair streak eggs are brown, and they're really well camouflaged and really, really hard to spot. So doing egg counts, as we do for brown hair streaks, isn't overly practical with this species. The caterpillars are really remarkable. They do blend in incredibly well with the blackthorn leaves, so they're very cryptic. They've even got the kind of serrated edge, which has got the kind of purple hue to match the blackthorn leaves. So they are, again, very hard to find as a caterpillar. Again, personally, I spent quite a lot of time looking for them, and I found one in 10 hours. It took me to find a single caterpillar. So again, gives you an idea of how hard they are to find as a species. Pupa, again, very cryptic. They've got this remarkable mimicry of bird droppings, and There's a kind of lighter form, as it's called, and a darker form, but yeah, they've got this remarkable mimicry, and again, they're very hard to find. So the butterfly itself, so it's small. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the hair streak family and the blues and the coppers. They are small. So it's around the size of a 2p and similar color actually. It's just that kind of bronze color. And as I said before, it's only got a short flight period. And alongside like a lot of the other hair streaks, it can be quite sedentary. So unless it's got like really nice weather conditions, it's quite happy just chilling and like basking or being quite sedentary. So it does like sunshine, but if there's wind or cloud, it's just not overly active at times. And the other thing about it is it's often, certainly here in Epsom, it's in the tops of the blackthorn bushes. So here we've got a lot of rise. The blackthorns is kind of 2 to 3 meters high, and you'll see uh, the black hairstree. If you know where you're looking, they'll be bobbling along the top of the blackthorn bushes, and in the oak trees as well. So they're really hard to spot unless you're looking up and looking for them in particular. So if you're a transect walker, eyes are often at ground level, you're looking at kind of other species as well. And unless your transect is passing the blackthorn or the particular area where they are, they're kind of often hard to pick up. And then unless you're really trained and expecting to see them, they can be confused with the white letter hair streak as well. So I started looking at this butterfly in around 2020 and starting to research the colony here in Epsom. And when I started looking into this, it was suggested to me that based on the research of a guy called Dave Moscovich, who'd done some work in America on an elfin butterfly, which is in the same family group, that the caterpillars might glow in the dark. And I was pretty skeptical about this, I have to say, because it's such a hard butterfly to spot. But what I found was if you shine a UV torch on the caterpillars, they glow extremely well. They're really easy to spot, especially when they get to the larger instars. So I've been using this and trialing this as a technique in detail here in Epsom. So this gives an example of just kind of to demonstrate the value of the technique. So what I've done is set up 5 sites here in Epsom. I did a 10-minute count with a UV torch for caterpillars, and then a 10-minute count for adults in the same year. And I've been doing this consistently for a while now. And what I found was basically, I found a lot more caterpillars, and this is the data for the maximum number recorded in the survey for both. And uh, what I've also found, I haven't got the data here, but doing this year in, year out, you find that the caterpillar count is very consistent generally, and the butterfly count, due to the sedentary nature and the kind of impact of the weather conditions, can be really variable in a year. So there's other things you can learn if you start to look at earlier stage in the life cycle. So one of the ones is that, as I mentioned, that the flight period is very short for this butterfly. It's hard to spot, so you can very easily miss the kind of window of when to start surveying if you're surveying for the adults alone. If you've got data on the caterpillars, what I've done here in Epsom is when they get to the last instar, they're static before pupation, and they form a silk pad. So I can do a loop lock, a kind of garden tag where that caterpillar is, and then I can return in the daytime and monitor the pupa as they pupate. So you can really then know when you need to start your adult surveys if you want to do that. But also you can look at things like predation rates. You can really examine what's going on throughout the life cycle of this of butterfly. So this gives some data from a couple of years ago, and you can see on the left-hand side is the count for the caterpillars, and then on the right-hand side is the count for the butterflies. And then what I've added in here is the green. And you can see basically as the transfer from caterpillars into pupa to adults. So you can see at any stage in the year where this butterfly is in terms of its life cycle. The colours on the left-hand side for the caterpillars are the different instars. So yellow is instar 2, uh, green is instar 3, and then red is instar 4, the final instar for this species. So as I say, using this technique, you can really look at the whole of the life cycle. So I've looked at transferability of this as well. So I've looked at this in a bit more detail. There's two types of torches people can buy. There's the 365 torch, which is the more true UV wavelength. And then there's the more common type, which is 385 to 395. And there is a different effect with these different torches, with the different wavelengths when you shine on a caterpillar. That's not too surprising given the chemistry going on in the molecules, that different wavelengths promote different responses. But what I found effectively is the hair streaks caterpillars glow, and the coppers, so small and large coppers, both glow, certainly at 365. But it's very mixed. You get a very mixed response when you look at the blues. And the only blue I've found here in the UK that glows under this UV torch technique is the holly blue. So brown argus, common blue, Adonis blue, chalk hill blue, those species don't glow, and same with the small blue. But we're very much at early stage with this, so we're really keen to start mapping out what species glow and what don't glow. And we're kind of at the stage where if you want to know what glows, you have to test it in the field. We haven't got a kind of, by any stretch, a kind of complete understanding of this technique, and we just want to look at more species to understand the biology going on and the transferability and, kind of understanding what species and where this technique can help. So I was just going to wrap up with some of the work we've been doing here at Butterfly Conservation. So we've developed two things. So one is some guidance we call it casual guidance. So that's if people want to go out and basically test caterpillars. So that's butterfly and moth caterpillars. So we're really keen to get a wider data set on what species and what caterpillars are glowing. And we've got some guidance around that. And then as what's also been mentioned is, I think the research I've been doing really does show that this caterpillar counting is the way to monitor black hair streaks. It's far more stable and it can be done a lot more systematically than monitoring the adults, which is particularly hard. So we're looking to trial that in a lot more detail this year as well. We did a bit of trialing last year, and we're looking to introduce that as a kind of formal guidance for monitoring the species in particular. So places to go for further information is the Butterfly Conservation UV page. So I've just given the details there at that to the top. And if you've got any questions, just drop me a line. There's my email address at the University of Sussex. Just a couple of acknowledgements. So locally, people have been fantastic. So the people in the group, Stephen Lofting chairs our UV group, and then Bill, Simon, and Francis. Stuart and Sarah have been helping out with some of the surveying I've been doing here at Epsom, and Alan and Dave have been my supervisors for the PhD and the doctoral work I've been doing.
Thank you, Gareth. That was brilliant. And it just makes me realize, people like everyone on this call has been observing and recording butterflies for hundreds of years, but there's still more things to learn, still new techniques to try and experiment with as well. So thanks for your run through of that. Now, there's a few sort of quite technical questions in the chat. So what I might do is actually transfer those to the Q&A, and then you could work through some of those things like around the safety of using the UV torches, for example. I think your slide that talked about the different types of torches will be really useful for us to include in the notes as well, because there's some questions about the different types. But I think it's fair to say that you're really at the experimental stage at the moment and seeing which torches, which types of butterfly and which life stages are
Yeah,
monitorable?
it's all new science. So I got contacted by some folk in Australia. They've got 6 endangered butterflies in the group, saying, "Oh, well, will this work?" And I'd said, "Well, the only way to find out is to, trial it really." So I went out to New South Wales in December to do some research out there, and it's all new science. That's the first ever caterpillar someone's looked at in Australia with a UV torch and recorded whether it will support their conservation efforts.
It's cutting edge stuff. Well, thank you very much for introducing it to us today. Many people it will be new, and I'm sure that you're going to get some interest in others who'd like to join in as well in this new technique, and keep the information coming. So thank you very much. I will at this point allow everyone to take a 10-minute break and enjoy your 11s, and we'll see you back here at 10 past 11 for something that you're all looking forward to, I know, which is Dr. Marc Botham with some of those sneak preview results that we've been looking forward to from the UKBMS.
Most of you have probably been to this meeting before, so you'll know me and what I do. But for those that don't, I'm Marc Botham. I work for the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And as Chloe's already mentioned, and I do enjoy giving the results. I didn't enjoy it so much last year because it was a pretty bad year in 2024, but it's going to be a bit better this year. I hope I can show you that. But I've been working on this for nearly 20 years with various different people from Butterfly Conservation, BTO and JNCC, and it's been a real privilege and pleasure. And it's just such an amazing resource. We've already mentioned it before. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour, and the results are out on our website and everything, but not the official results. We're still going to do a press release in mid-April, so please don't share any of these slides, which give you more detailed information about everything, but I hope you enjoy them anyway. I started with this beautiful picture of a purple emperor because purple emperor did rather well in 2025, and what a stunning picture if I just go back, by Tim Melling. It's the best picture I've come across so far. Whenever I've seen purple emperor, which is very few actually in this country, I've never seen one looking that stunning, but cracking picture. And Joe covered this very well, and we've had a discussion about this beforehand. I just still wanted to reiterate the amazing achievement of half a decade of recording butterflies. We heard the stats from Joe, and I've put this silly little cartoon of going back to the moon and back more than twice, recording butterflies. I think it's absolutely astonishing the numbers that we recorded, and the importance of these records is coming through. We've had a lot of stuff in the chat about the big butterfly count, and also about wider countryside monitoring as well, where the timing of all of these schemes is affected by how things are changing with the climate. But the gold standard here, the UKBMS standardized monitoring, these transects that we have to go out every week, a lot of work, but they give the backbone from which we can then use the flight periods to adjust all these other methods so that we can use them to their maximum and get the most out of them. So I just wanted to use this slide really as an early, very big thank you to everyone and all the amazing work that's been done over the 50 years. It's absolutely astonishing. I won't go over this in detail because Joe covered this as well, which is kind of nice for me because I've got lots to get through. But just to cover the kind of coverage of where the transects are, and to kind of make it, we've always had this kind of bias with transects being where people can get to easily. So the next slide, which shows the targeted surveys, kind of shows you that there's good coverage of these in areas where we're not able to get so much with those traditional transects. And then with this, the wider countryside transects imposed over the top of that, when I show you them all together, you can see actually we have incredible coverage. And we've always had a fairly good coverage across the UK, but not so much as obviously we do now with this a massive amount of sites that we've got now, nearly 4,000 sites, which is just absolutely incredible. It's the traditional transects which take the most effort, which are the ones where we year upon year get even more sites. So again, thank you very much for that amazing effort, which enables us to look at butterflies in so much more detail. Now, it's always remiss to not mention the weather in any annual summary of what the stats show. And last year was exceptional. The year before was exceptional. In fact, I feel like every year now I get to say the weather was exceptional for one reason or another. But last year really was quite bonkers, in my opinion. I mean, it was the warmest year on record. It was the sunniest year on record. The word unprecedented was used in lots of press from Met Office about unprecedented heat waves and stuff like that, loads of heat waves. And for me, certainly, and I'm sure it was endured throughout, when you look at these plots, I'm not going to go into detail of these plots, temperature at the top, sunshine in the middle and rainfall at the bottom. You can see the average is the line that goes across the middle. Anything above that means it was 2025 was well above the average, and anything below it is below the average. So you can see for sunshine, pretty much all year, well above average. And temperature well above average. That's why we had the warmest and sunniest years. And the rainfall well below average. We got a bit of rain in June in some parts of the UK, which probably helped with reviving some of the plants, but not enough for most places. It was just very, very dry until we got to September, when it just felt like it rained almost continually for the rest of the year for me down here in Oxfordshire. And, you know, the hot weather does help with butterflies. It helps them be active, so we see them. It helps us get out, because we've got these strict weather conditions where otherwise we wouldn't be able to get out at all. And I love this little quote because it's so perfect from the Conservation, which was released in July. A nice little piece. Hot weather helps butterflies until it doesn't. And this is a picture of my transect at the start of August. And I could have taken this at the end of June going into July, and it wouldn't have looked much different, because it was so dry on this southern-facing calcareous piece of grassland that the grass had almost disappeared, and the flowers had gone over really quickly. And it looked, it just didn't look like anything I normally see in the United Kingdom, to be honest. Here's another picture, and that's where I walked my route along that hedgerow all the way around, and it's just astonishing how baked it was. So, of course, the weather had an enormous impact. And the next couple of slides are actually going to be quite useful for some of the comments that have come up in the chat. So this is the phenology. And what I've done here is I've shown you the flight periods, the mean flight periods, because the BMS doesn't start till April, so we miss a lot of the very first appearances. So on the bottom axis, you've got the mean flight data averaged across the last 10 years before 2025, because there's no point in me looking at the series, because obviously things have advanced massively compared to the beginning of the surveys by 3 weeks for a lot of species. And on the y-axis, I've got the mean flight date for 2025 of all the species. So the little blue line going through the middle there, if I just show you that one, is a one-to-one line. So anything that falls above that line means that those species are out later than they were for the last 10 years before that, and anything below means they were out a lot earlier. And this is compared just to the last 10 years, where we know things have already advanced quite a lot. So you can see here that apart from a few odd species slightly above the line, everything falls well below the line. And it was such an early year last year, it was incredible. Everything was out very early. And even those species that you see just above the line, suggesting that they were slightly later, are actually species where the phenology has been dragged later because they had extra generations, or bigger extra generations than normal, which means that pulled the start dates a bit further towards the end of the season. So that's the only reason why they're above it. So in effect, everything was early. Now, to go on what kind of a year it was, I don't know if anyone had a guess at this. It felt like it was going to be a superb year because the year started so well. But of course, we know that butterflies have reached a bit of a low ebb. So actually, despite being really good, it ranked 20th in 50 years. So just above average. So at least it was above average, but still it's an average year compared to what we've had since 1976. Now, for those of you who remembered what I presented last year, these stats on the left now show almost at the mirror opposite to what we showed last year. So 51 species showed an annual increase, while 7 species showed a decrease. And last year it was exactly the other way around, with most of the species showing a decline. So I guess in some ways we shouldn't be too surprised, because it was such a bad year in 2024 that there was so many increases. So I'll come on to talk about the long-term trends in a moment. Of those indices, of those species that we do, 58 species for the UK, 35, so 60%, produced an abundance index that was above the average for the entire series. And 22, so 38%, showed an abundance indices that was below the average. So although most species increased, there was still, over a third of species that were producing below average indices. Now, for once, I think there's very few years where I've had this opportunity to say that no species recorded their best or their worst year on record in 2025 across all the sites in the UK. So nothing to report there. So I thought I'd just show a quick breakdown of the long-term trends, and also the ranks of split by country, because although it was the 20th year in UK, you can see that in England and Wales, the picture is rather different to Scotland and Northern Ireland. So when we look at the species that are declining, increasing, we've got slightly more species significantly declining in England and in Wales than we have increasing, but it's the opposite in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where we have far more species actually showing long-term increases since 1976, well, 1979 in Scotland and later in Northern Ireland, but throughout the whole series. And you can see that the rank of 2025 also differs greatly. Now, we have to take into account that they've got different lengths of time series, but in Scotland, it was the 12th best year in 47 years. And in Northern Ireland, it was the 7th best year in 22 years. Whereas in Wales, that was the lowest rank, 23rd out of 50, and England, again, also quite low, 22. So that drags that average for the UK down. But very different things going on across the different countries in the UK. Something else which I'll come to talk about later as well. Now, one of the things, I've done something slightly different this year. I wanted to just kind of go back to those species that I showed you in 2024 that had their worst year on record, just to see how much they'd bounced back in 2025 and whether that's been really beneficial for the species or it's just as minor bounce back. So these are the species that all had their worst year in 2024. Grizzle skipper was up by 55%, great news. Small skipper up by 37%. Large skipper up by 42%. We'll look at this one for wood white, up by 204%. Green vein white, after having its worst year on record, 159% up. Small pearl border for Tilley up by 38%. Small tortoiseshell even up by 125%. I didn't see one myself, and we'll talk about that again later, as per usual with the small tortoiseshell. Small copper up by 154%. And chalk-hill blue up by 103%. So I think we can agree they all had a much better year in 2025 than they did in 2024. But when we look at the long-term trends for these species, even with that bump up in 2025, we can see that they're all showing significant declines, with the exception of chalk-hill blue, which is showing a decline of 18%, but that's with all the variation accounted for, it's not statistically significant. But these are all declining, and species like the small tortoiseshell down by 87%, of highly significant, continues to do really badly. When we just look at the average number of butterflies, the reason for doing this is not to kind of compare the actual number of butterflies, because we know that it's less than it was in the overall series. In the red line here, you've got the numbers, the average number counted per week across all transits for 2025. In the dotted line, you've got the previous 10 years to that, and in the black full line, you've got the entire series. What's important from my point of view for this is that although the peaks are smaller, it was quite a good year in 2025, but very similar to the 10-year average. But just look at the shift in that peak. It's so much earlier. So here we've got the red line, almost it's peaked before you get the peak in the 10-year series, and well before, obviously, the series. So 2025 was just exceptionally early. Now, I only have what I see on my local translate, which is south-facing and quite far south anyway. But pretty much everything was over by the end of June, early July for me, and it just felt like, you know, the last month or so of walking the transect, even in August, was pretty abysmal, apart from some whites. So I just did a couple of other quick things. I looked at 2025 compared to 2024, just to show, you know, obviously there was a huge increase in numbers generally across the entire season, but you can see that that peak is quite considerably earlier, but it does go into July, and this covers the whole of the UK. But what surprised me more is when I decided just to have a quick look to 1976, the first year when, with the renowned heat wave and butterflies having a superb year. And the red line there shows you 2025, and the blue line shows you 1976. And you can actually see that the peak's actually roughly in the same area and it follows a similar pattern. So clearly, you know, these hot years happen throughout the series and have the same kind of effects on butterfly numbers and when they're emerging. A quick look at habitat specialists versus the wider countryside species. So this is a plot of a composite across the two groups. So in blue, you've got the wider countryside species. In red, you've got the habitat specialists. And what I've done here, because the interesting thing for me is I've put the mean line throughout. So the mean abundance, there's a line through this series. So there's a blue line going through the blue one there and a red line going through there. And what it shows to me there is that habitat specialists obviously did really badly after the drought in 1976, and then they didn't really bounce back that much probably because the habitat's not available to them. Wider countryside species bounced back quite well, but then over the long term we've got this kind of stabilization of the habitat specialists, and in 2025 we actually see that the overall index across all of the habitat specialist species is above the average. Whereas for wider countryside species, it's still below the average. And this really, you know, kind of exemplifies that while we're doing well looking after some of our prized habitats and everything, the wider countryside is still getting kind of worse and worse. And we need to look at that, I think. So now coming on to the individual trends, I hope I've covered that. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the chat. I'll try and answer them. I'll go through the families as usual. So starting with the swallowtail, which is the only representative of its family, up by 60%. So a good increase for this species in 2025. Looking at the skippers as a whole, you can see just a couple of species did badly and actually showed a decline compared to 2024. So Essex skipper and checkered skipper, and the rest of them showed an increase. And of those species, I just wanted to pull out the small skipper again, which seems to keep featuring, because despite a 37% increase, it's still got a highly significant decline, and it was still the 5th worst year on record, ranked 46. And the last 10 years have all been well below the long-term average for this species. But if we look at it just in Wales, it had its worst year on record in 2025 and continues to do really badly over there. So I don't know what's going on there, but that's pretty serious. In a year where we had really good weather, this species still did quite badly. Dingy skipper, however, was up by 82%, and the beautiful thing here that I would like to show, but if you saw the plot from the previous year, you'll know that they had a line going through it that showed a significant decline over the long term. But with these increasing numbers and a lot of conservation work going in place as well, this species now has a long-term trend which is classed as being stabilized. There's no significant decline present anymore across the entire series. So good news there. And one of the things that struck me about dingy skipper last year, reading some kind of fora and on butterflies across the country, is we know that it's been having a second generation more and more regularly in the very south of the country, but this seems to be true also throughout a lot of its range now, with records in the East Midlands from second generations. And it may even be sneaking in the third generation in the south, because the second generation seemed fairly early in some southern countries, but it's quite difficult to look at that because it's towards the end of the season and there's so few records compared to the overall numbers. But great stuff for the dingy skipper. The whites, well, we've already heard how well some of the whites did, and except for the brimstone, which actually showed an annual decline, all of those species were up. And I'll come on to talk about the common whites because they really did have an exceptional year. So here they are, the large white, small white, and green veined white. So you can see on the bottom there, I've put the stats for the UK, how much they increased compared to 2024. Large white up by 210% and its 4th best year on record. Small white up by 152%, and also green vein white up by 159%. So they're both within their 10, 8th and 10th best years respectively. And then split by country at the top, you can see the increases are mirrored across all of the countries. Sometimes we have some slight differences in one country, but here the whites did well everywhere in the UK, and in Scotland, large white, small white both had their best year on record. And if we just look at the total numbers of common whites, so this is the average number of just the common whites recorded per transit over all the transits, per week. In the red line again, you've got 2025. The black line, it's the last decade preceding that, and then for the dashed line, you've got the entire series. And again, one of the things that really stands out there is that peak right in the middle, which is well before the kind of later peaks in both the last 10 years and the series. So yep, those whites did extremely well, and it's a group of species that, when they do really well, makes transits a lot harder work, especially because it's really sunny and they're very active, because they are quite difficult. And later in the season, they have much more overlap in their kind of sizes and markings. And it'll be interesting, very interesting to hear about the southern small white and what we're going to do about that in the future if it starts spreading, because these are already quite difficult enough. I mentioned wood white earlier. What a fantastic year it had, 204% up, 8th best year on record, and the best year since 1985. And another thing that came out was that we got our first transit record of this species on a transect in Wales in 2025. So a fantastic year for this species, just over the border from known populations in England. Now, the browns, again, I don't know how many times I've presented tables where all of them are in blue because they all increased, but for the browns, this is definitely the case. Although you can see for meadow brown, the annual change wasn't that great, but the browns had a good year in terms of compared to 2024 when they didn't have a particularly good year. And that's one of the key things that comes out here. And it was interesting to see that meadow brown didn't feature in the kind of most recorded species. It was the whites that seemed to take over in 2025 on other counts. And here you can see Meadow Brown was only up by 2% compared to 2024. Gatekeeper had a good year, up by 59%, and then Marbled White and Ringlet both up by just over around 15%. I'm taking, like I did with the whites, the kind of average count of just these species on Transects. You can see again that the red line for 2025 is lower than what we had in the last decade. So these species, they made an improvement from 2024, but they were clearly affected by some of these drought conditions. On my Transect, Marbled White was out for a very limited time in good numbers, but for only a couple of weeks, and then it had just disappeared. And Ringlet even less so. But Gatekeeper did seem to hang around for quite a while and have a good year. And the other brown I want to just highlight is the Speckled Wood, which had a fantastic year, up by 52%. Its fourth best year on record. This is a species that's been expanding its range and also increasing in abundance in the long term, but it has had a few kind of poor years recently, which has kind of held that back a bit. I want to look at the country levels. I think it was mentioned earlier about how well it does in Northern Ireland. Not Northern Ireland, in Wales, sorry, and it was up by 63% in Wales. You can see in the bottom right hand there. And up by 52% in England, and up by 70% in Scotland, where it had its best year on record, and then up by 33% in Northern Ireland. The fritillaries, all but one species increased compared to 24, and the one that didn't was marsh fritillary. I haven't looked into this. I didn't have time to go into this properly, so I'm not going to present that, but it'll be interesting to look at what happened with that species last year. The ones I've highlighted, the Heath fritillary, and it's impossible not to with that kind of improvement there, 236% in an above average year, and the best year since 2006. Now, what I've also highlighted down here in the left is the sites that the Transect sites, I have to make this clear because we do have non-Transect sites here which just count Heath fritillaries in given areas, and their counts are in the thousands. But this just shows you that, you know, what we got on some of the Transects, some of the biggest counts, 4 counts in the hundreds in 2025 in East Blean, Poundwood, and other woods, other parts of the Blean Woods there. East Blean Woods with 548 on the Transect there in 2025, quite exceptional. So really good news to see this rare species doing well. And that was, you know, that was mirrored across the range. It wasn't just in Kent and Essex. It's just that happened to be where the numbers were biggest on Transects. So they're the ones I've shown you. And the other one that I don't often mention because it's been expanding, it's largely been doing okay, but it did have a couple of pretty bad years, particularly in 2024. So it was really nice to see the dark green fritillary turning up in better numbers again, well above average, and 151% up compared to 2024. More of us get to see this fritillary than perhaps we get to see the other fritillaries because it's more widespread. So it's nice to be able to start seeing these again in better numbers. The Vanessis had a good year. All species increased compared to 2025. And at the top there, Painted Lady, I didn't show you a plot of migrant species, but the migrants had a really, really good year, the regular migrants. And Clouded Yellow in particular, particularly from kind of mid-season onwards, started coming in much better numbers and people reporting, you know, regularly quite good counts of this species. Small Tortoise, you can see there, had a great increase of 125%, but I will come on to talk about that in a moment. But all species showed some increase compared to 2024. And the Purple Emperor, as I talked about on the title slide, I wanted to show you this one because it had its second best year on record. And numbers were really up compared to 2024, but you can see it's also increasing in the long term. And here you can see the number of Transects that record Purple Emperor. And the important thing to kind of remember here is that Purple Emperor is not a species that's easily detected on Transects. It's a species which, even if it's a known site, you could easily miss in a year unless you've got really good numbers. So, and then the other thing to obviously appreciate in this top plot here is that the number of Transects generally has been increasing. So you're likely to get more on Purple Emperor. But I think it still shows something that's very encouraging, that the Purple Emperor really has been picked up more and more on Transects, which means its numbers must be pretty good on those sites. And again, here, looking at this table below, the sites producing indices with 5 or more counted, which might not sound like many, but for Purple Emperor is pretty good on a Transect. It's pretty astonishing. Most of the counts are single figures of 1 or 2. And so getting 14 at Oversley Wood in Warwickshire in 2025 is just exceptional, really. And these plots on the right just show you the expansion. So this is looking back at 1995 and the number of records of purple emperor and where they were in the UK on transects. I must emphasize that's just on transects. And then by 2005, that's where they are. By 2015, you can see there's way more sites, but they're also expanding quite a lot. And this is what we have in 2025, quite exceptional, really. So this species seems to be doing very well. However, there's always something that's not going quite so well. I just talked about the small tortoiseshell and its annual change up by 125%. But again, we have to remember that 2024 was an exceptionally poor year for it. It's worst on record, but really low indices. And last year I showed you a plot of how many sites, proportion to the number of sites we monitor, actually record small tortoiseshell, and it's been dropping over time. I mentioned when I was talking about my transit that I didn't see it again last year. I haven't seen it for 3, maybe 4 years on the transit now. And locally around me in Oxfordshire, it's becoming a very uncommon species. I can't even remember seeing more than a couple last year, if any, in fact, I can't remember. But you can see the long-term trend is still a significant decline, and the 10-year trend is also a significant decline. And actually 2025, despite that big increase of over 100%, was still its second worst year on record. So there's something really quite serious going on for the small tortoiseshell. And I feel like a bit of a long playing record because it comes up every year. But this is a species, and I probably said the same thing last year, that's very kind of dear to me because it's a childhood species which was all over the buddleias. So it was one of the first butterflies I started recording. So to suddenly not see it, and I've got buddleias all over our garden here, and there's lots of nectar sources around this urban area, but we just don't see them anymore. It's incredible. I'm looking at the country trends because, something's got hidden on the Northern Ireland one, but it was up more in Northern Ireland proportionally than in the other countries. And I wanted to highlight that because this has been happening for quite a while, except for last year when it had a bad year in all countries. In Northern Ireland, it's doing rather well, and it had its second best year on record in 2025. I'm sorry that figure's got missing, and I don't know offhand to give it you, but it did show a big increase. So, yeah, small tortoiseshell not doing so well in most of the UK, but in Northern Ireland, something different going on, and it'd be interesting to know what that is. Another species that's in a family on its own, the Duke of Burgundy. Not much to say about this really, up by 15%, so a bit of increase compared to 2024 when it had a small decline compared to the year before. So seems to be relatively stable over the last few years, not doing much, and above average for the series. So good news, I guess. Looking at the blues, the biggest, the most species in a group for the ones that we split down here. 3 species did actually show a decline: the brown hairstreak, the northern brown argus, and the large blue. You can see the large blue is quite a big decline there. But at the top of there, it's really nice to see common blue and small copper coming out because they've been having some pretty horrendous years in the last decade or so across the UK. And they're the ones I'm going to actually highlight after the large blue. So a really poor year for large blue. It's worst year on record since 1999. And down by 79%, you can see producing a below average indices in 2025. Now, most of the data for these comes from egg counts, which is a lot of work, but it's fantastic to see this data still coming in. But there are an increasing number of transects with the adults on. So I thought, I haven't shown it here, but I thought I'd have a quick look to make sure it wasn't just because of the eggs, because obviously the egg laying period would have been when there's huge drought affecting the host plants, but it was also reflected in the number of adults on transects as well. So it was both adults and the number of eggs. So the drought really did cause a big decline for this species in 2025. And the last species I just mentioned, common blue and small copper, because these are 2 widespread common wider countryside species that have been doing rather poorly. They both showed a really big increase in 2025, up by 169% for the common blue and up by 154% for the small copper. But you can see for the small copper that the trend for the entire series is still of a long-term decline. So we still need to kind of keep an eye on these species and kind of work out what's going on with them, because a lot of the species that I've kind of reflected upon during this have been the common and widespread species, and they have increases when the weather's good, and it's fantastic. But we need to do something more about the kind of the matrix habitats between those sites that are well looked after to make sure that these can do better in the long term as well. I'd just like to finish by thanking everyone again. I'm very lazy with my photographs. I haven't labelled them all, and I've been a bit lazy this year, for which I apologise. I'm not changing many of them from the previous year. I'll try and up that a bit next year. But thank you everyone for listening, and another big thank you to all the volunteer transect recorders and coordinators, because it's just a monumental effort that goes into collecting this data, and it allows us to look at things like phenology. It allows us to look at things like how well species are doing, even when they've had good years. So without that, we'd be in a much worse place. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marc. That was an emotional and scientific roller coaster, as always. Really, really fascinating and a lot to digest in there. So thank you again. I would say it also is a great summary, and we're seeing this in the chat too, of how both the National Recording Scheme, which obviously accepts unstructured as well as structured records, and the UKBMS, which is all about those structured records, are really a effort from the local through to the national level. So we're relying on participation by everybody throughout all of the UK countries, and we're seeing some good chat from all of the countries as well today. And it really ties back to Joe's talk at the beginning as well about participation. So if any of you are in places where maybe we don't have so many transects and you'd like to get involved, please look at Joe's links in the chat and find out more. So I better stop chatting, and I've got an important question I can see to ask Dave Wainwright from Butterfly Conservation, which is, who is our next speaker, which is, and how is the large heath doing, by the way, Dave, if you're ready to go?
So basic answer is we know very, very little about how it's doing. So hopefully I'm going to talk today about some of the work that's been started in the last couple of years and work that's due to be completed in the next few years. Basically, our information on large heath is outdated. I mean, certainly for England, there's surveys were done in Cumbria in the late 1990s, across Northumberland in the period 95 to 99, and in the North York Moors, 2004-ish sort of thing. And those were really extensive surveys that covered a lot of ground. UKBMS wise, we have a UK trend, but that's effectively based around transects undertaken in Scotland. If you break it down into the separate devolved nations, there's no trends for England, Wales, or Northern Ireland. And that's despite over 200 sites where the large heath has been recorded. We should also be more up to speed with what's happening for the large heath, because it's only one of 4 UK species with a northerly distribution, which brings into question what impact will climate change have on it. There are also plenty of unknowns surrounding mire restoration schemes. There's a lot of resource being put into helping repair habitats for water retention to reduce flooding, and of course carbon capture, so that we don't know what the biological effect is on species such as large heath that are tuned into these habitats that depend on them. Other mires, the restored mires suitable for large heath straight away? Does it take time? So on. We don't know how other sites are faring, and Europe-wide, it's a species that's not doing terrifically well. It's been reclassified as endangered at European level, which suggests that there are ongoing threats to the species there, mainly through habitat destruction, degradation. I don't know what you can see that I'm showing, but hopefully the picture on the screen shows a distribution map of the large heath, 2015 to 2019. There's a lot more blue dots on there than there is the typical yellow, red, and orange ones that we normally see on the sort of sequence of distribution maps that are produced by Butterfly Conservation. And that doesn't really reflect, all those blue dots aren't sites where the large heath has disappeared from necessarily. They could easily be just sites that no one's visited in that time frame. So it's a variable species that flies kind of late May through to July, depending on latitude, and the kind of phenology is really variable. I know Last year, most of the flight period in Northumberland fell in the month of June. The year previous to that, it had barely started by the end of June. There is that much, sort of variation depending on the weather conditions. Basically, the eggs are laid, the caterpillars emerge in, sort of 10 to 14 days, something like that. And then it's a species that has a long larval phase. It goes through as a half-grown larva and third instar. And some of these caterpillars do, or in the past, survive for 2 years. I don't know whether that's been tested recently. I don't know whether it's an adaptation that's disappeared as the climate's changed. But certainly going back 20 years, when I used to spend a lot of time looking at this species, we used to find small larvae during the flight period that were too big to have been generated in the same year, and that were clearly going on a longer developmental phase. And the butterfly pupates in June, I don't know if you can see my slide, but there's a rather beautiful looking pupa on there. Typically, the lifespan of the large heath is short. Mark recapture studies suggest kind of between 3 to 4 days. They will live for longer in captivity, obviously. Quite often, the pairing's brief, the males kind of patrol about. They find an unmated female. They pair up really quite quickly, sort of thing. I've seen them pair for like 20 minutes, and then the females start laying eggs almost straight away after that. So, they're kind of clearly adapted to these kind of short weather windows, things like that. Quite often the eggs are laid in sparse vegetation overlaying sphagnum, where the females can crawl about quite easily, and quite often they lay their eggs on dead cotton grass. They're not obliged to lay it on the living cotton grass. They're like kind of sparse stuff where they can crawl about and curl their abdomen underneath, and usually they stick an egg to the underside of a horizontal blade of vegetation, something like that. They're not really specific as to what they're attached to, but quite often it's dead vegetation. Habitat-wise, mire conditions vary. If you can see the screen, the one on the left is quite degraded. It is peaty. Those tussocks have cotton grass in. That site would just about retain a population of large heath. The one on the right is in better condition, and numbers there will be quite big. Typically, when sites are overgrazed, you will, retain the cotton grass long after most of the kind of other bog component features, such as sphagnum, moss, and, sort of nectar plants like crossleaf heath and bog asphodel are, they kind of disappear from it. So almost the last thing to go is the cotton grass in a way. Mentioned briefly before, bog restorations, certainly some of the sites I'm going to talk about shortly. The Forestry Commission have taken down a lot of conifers from the kind of catchment areas of the bogs, if you like. So in the far distance between the cleared conifers and the standing conifers, there's an area of intact peat bog sort of thing. And essentially what you're looking for is this kind of reversion back to kind of cotton grass overgrowing sphagnum with crossleaf heath and other bog species in there. So in terms of work we were doing in 2025 in north of England, we were working in an area called Butterburn Flow, and all those kind of, I don't know whether you can see the slides or not, but those kind of brown and patchy areas are peat bogs, basically. The green areas are blocks of conifers. This is in the southern part of Kielder Forest. And the scale from left to right on that map is about 5 miles. The starting point for this, because what we were trying to do was set up a monitoring system. We were supported by Forestry England in doing some, setting up a monitoring system. And the starting point was to establish a single species transect, which was set up at a site called Felicia Moss. This is a 7-section transect and walked, once a week using the UKBMS with the upland temperature thresholds uploaded onto it. Results-wise, we got the first record on the 2nd of June and the last record on the 30th of June with a maximum count of 14 on the 20th of June, which kind of helped us to establish a flight period, if you like. I'll come to that in a minute. So that essentially sets out the data. As you can see, the counts were quite low. Walking that route took about 45 minutes. So a maximum count on the 20th of June of 14 would translate into a count per hour of about just under 20 butterflies. So having established the flight period, what we were also trying to do was undertake time counts. Now, the site in the top right is the transect site, but we were also asked to monitor populations across the other 8 sites that are shown on this screen. I don't know whether you can see it or not, and undertake time counts there. And the point of doing that is to the point of doing the transect is to kind of ascertain whereabouts in the flight period the time counts fell. So obviously, if you undertook thanks, Darren. I just spotted your message. That's a big relief. So anything round about the 3rd of June, say, a time count undertaken there, you would expect to be kind of a lot lower than one undertaken kind of around the 24th or something like that, the arrow on the right. And again, it's this adjustment for phenology that Ian touched upon. I think Richard touched on in the chat when there was discussion around the big butterfly count. Just kind of setting the context, if you like, of when counts were undertaken. In terms of the findings, the transect, we still missed a week. I mean, I didn't touch upon this because I was a bit flustered at the start of the talk, but the reason a lot of these sites are undersampled is because the terrain's pretty hostile, the weather's pretty crap, and a lot of the sites are nowhere near where people live, which makes life difficult. And it's difficult to get around those constraints. So the transect counts, we missed a week, got a 4-week flight period in 2025. We were able to establish when the peak flight period was fairly closely, and then that transect is obviously repeatable with willing bodies on the ground. In terms of the time counts, out of the 8 sites, we were able to undertake 3 separate counts at 6 of those sites. So that was pretty good coverage. That was, the weather, as had already been touched on for 2025, was actually pretty good. So that kind of exceeded expectation, if you like. Peak flight period at each site linked well, because obviously we got a feel for when the peak flight period was. We've been able to sample them, most of them on 3 occasions. And it did correspond really closely with that was recorded on the transect at Felicia Moss, which kind of lends validity to the method, if you like. Thanks to the transect, the time counts were able to be contextualized, and again, these are potentially repeatable. And it's kind of a useful exercise in a way. I don't think I would sample those sites again, given the difficulties actually accessing them. They're not sites that you could readily send people onto unless they were kind of prepared for really rough terrain. And crossing it's not so much the walking across the peat bogs. That habitat is relatively okay to walk on, but crossing some of the clearfell sites that surround them, that is absolutely horrible terrain to walk across, really tricky to negotiate, sort of thing. But we kind of now know how much resource is needed to kind of set up that kind of monitored network, which actually would be certainly robust enough to generate some sort of county-wide trend, even possibly a national trend if it was repeated, sort of thing. And having that knowledge enables us to kind of advise partners on the level of staff input or staff and volunteer input they might need if they're going to try that particular exercise. So to basically summarise the Kielder work, we got a maximum transect count of 14. That's equates to about just under 20 per hour. But on some of the other sites, the best count of all, we got 119 large heath encounters per hour sort of thing, which is, that's up there with things like ringlets and stuff like that. On a ringlety site, it's a good number. The minimum was 7 per hour on a really degraded site. And the other counts were really good. Certainly the sites top right, not the transect site in the extreme right, but the two nearest to that, there were no previous records for those sites, and the random records for others were just 1s and 2s for most of those sites. I mean, we certainly established the populations that were a lot bigger than might be inferred from casual records. I'll briefly talk about work in Scotland that colleagues undertook. This is slightly different on the Karura estate. It's a former sporting estate that's in the process of being rewilded, if you like. The work includes peatland restoration. It's quite high altitude for large heath sites. I mean, certainly all those ones in Kielder would fall under that 400-metre level. These are kind of getting towards the top end of, the altitudes that large heath can be found at. And the role of BC staff in this was determining habitat responses and species responses to restoration work. And this gives an idea of what's been restored. A hagged area is generally where the peat has started drying out. And once peat starts drying out, it begins to degrade at quite a rapid rate. It begins to break down under aerobic conditions, if you like, sort of thing. And it rather than accumulating, it begins to disappear as carbon dioxide is released and, nutrients get washed out in flooding and stuff. So that's the damage. The re-wetted areas are pretty good for things like dragonflies and so on. And, will hopefully kind of restore the habitat. And what my colleagues did was undertake time counts across basically intact areas, degraded areas and restored areas, and compare and contrast between those sort of things. To help them do that, they recorded habitat condition using quadrats. If you're not familiar with that, it's essentially usually a 1 metre by 1 metre square, and you record the percentage cover or presence and absence of various habitat features. So things like hairstyle cotton grass cover was recorded. These are positive attributes. Cross-leaved heath, which is a main nectar source, the abundance of that was recorded. Sphagnum moss, sorry, I misspelt it there, was also recorded, but also negative indicators of degrading habitats were recorded. So things like dry mosses, purple moorgrass and woody scrub were also being recorded. And the habitat assessments did confirm differences between the intact, degraded and restored areas. Basically, the positive features were more abundant in intact areas. And also, this is an important finding. The large heath was encountered 4 to 5 times more frequently in the intact areas than in the degraded ones. And interestingly, the encounter rates were far lower than the ones we saw in England, but that is useful in itself and kind of confirms that although there were the restored areas, there hadn't been an uptick in the abundance of large heath in those areas. So that's a brief flavour of what butterfly conservation were engaged in last summer. But there's lots of other work going on in Northern Ireland, in Wales. We need people to help with surveys, particularly if they can undertake timed counts rather than just submitting casual records, because that actually sets a context of the numbers that they're seeing. So in terms of, there's different streams of funding being brought in for this. So in north of England, for example, there's a project called Making Peatlands Work for Lepidoptera. And as well as looking at large heath, the project staff are looking at species including small pearl-bordered fritillary, Manchester treble-bar, emperor moth, green hairstreak, and one or two others, sort of thing. In Northern Ireland, the aim is to, much the same as that study in Kielder Forest did, increase the number of transects so to be able to generate national trends, and also resurvey and areas that haven't been looked at, survey potential habitats. I mean, there are still sites to be discovered. Same kind of things being done in Wales. Interestingly, the findings in Wales are mixed. Georgie Paul, who's working there, has managed to find large heath on sites where it was either not been recorded for a long, long time or has never been recorded. Contrastingly, she was unable to find it on sites with historical records as well. So there's work still to be done there. So there's also habitat assessment work to be done. We need to know the condition of the vegetation, find out whether these peatland restoration schemes are working, which species they have a positive impact on, how long that process takes. And, having gleaned that knowledge, we're able to advise partners who are undertaking a lot of the restoration works on what those, what the impact on species are. There's questions we get asked about things like needs to introduce species to sites that have been restored, and it's at what point, we're able to advise better at what point that introduction should be done. When is that habitat likely to be right for them? But anyway, that's me, I think. Hopefully you could make sense of that.
Thank
got
you,
a little bit flustered, and
well, I think
I've overrun as well.
I think you've epitomised the determination and the perseverance that is required in these special habitats as well. You've just demonstrated it in delivering that talk, and it was all heard loud and clear. We could see the slides. Thank you to Darren, our
that's a brilliant
in the background there.
Job. Yeah,
he did a good job of getting rid of the internet gremlins there. So because of those little bit of problems, we've obviously started slightly later on that talk. So we've got 3 minutes break now before we start back at 12:10. Hopefully that's enough for everybody to stretch their legs if they need to, or I know I've pushed us on quite fast from those two fascinating talks. So if you've got any Q&As for Marc about all of those trends of the different species, what's happening in the different UK nations, or indeed for Dave on his work and the specialist surveys that are going on in different parts of the country, please put those in the Q&A, and we'll have the rest of the talk for the speakers to address those. So I'll see you in 2 minutes. Hello again. I hope everyone managed to at least stretch their arms and legs there for a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining us again, and I will just do a little preamble whilst people get back to their desks and their screens. So we're now going to go across the seas and have some contributions for this last section of the meeting from the Netherlands and Belgium. And so thank you very much for joining us, Berber Meulepas, and I know you're going to be talking to us about some research into nitrogen and heat effects on insects, and specifically around nettle feeding Lepidoptera. So looking forward to that, and over to you if you're able to share your screen.
Thank you. Okay, hello. My name is Berber, and I got the chance to talk to you today about the project I've been working on, indeed on nitrogen deposition and climatic warming on herbivorous insects and nettle feeding butterflies in particular. So we've already heard it come across this morning that globally we are seeing this ongoing decline of insect species, especially butterflies, which has been affecting our more rare species, but now also our more common species are in decline. And a good example of this can be found in the nettle-feeding butterfly community, which is a group of butterflies of which the caterpillars have specialized to feed on the stinging nettle as their host plant. And within this community, we are seeing diverging trends in both species abundance and distribution, where we see that, for example, the peacock butterfly and the red admiral have shown increasing numbers in the last decades, while other species like the tortoise shell and the map butterfly have experienced significant declines in recent years. And despite all sharing the same host plant, of course, which has become very widespread recently across Europe. So we kind of expect that maybe isolation and fragmentation of their habitat might be a less likely driver for these diverging patterns, making this a very interesting study system to look at other anthropogenically induced stressors like nitrogen pollution and climatic warming. Let me see, is my... Yeah. Nitrogen pollution strongly affects the host plant, so the quality of the stinging nettle on which the caterpillars are feeding, and climatic warming can affect both the host plant as well as the distribution and development of these butterfly species. And this is something that I'm working on in my project, so both on a very broad scale, where I try to link the monitoring data to the changes in weather conditions and nitrogen deposition data that we have of Europe, but also look at the host plant quality across Europe, and look at a more detailed scale by rearing experiments of these 4 species, seeing how in specific ways these stressors like temperature and food are affecting the development and the survival of these butterflies. So for the first part of my project, I focus on trying to understand these large-scale patterns across Europe, for which I'm using the European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme data, which also includes the UKBMS data. On the left, you can see a map of all the data of these 4 target species that has been collected through this monitoring scheme across Europe. And I think this is even not the most updated version. Now there's even a broader scale of sampling across Europe. And by layering environmental variables like elevation and precipitation and temperature, I try to divide Europe into different regions of high deposition, high nitrogen deposition, and temperature increase or low deposition, and see if we can compare between these regions how trends of these species are varying. And with this approach, I try to identify which environmental drivers are most consistently associated with maybe increases or declines, and whether these relationships differ between regions, hopefully allowing us to gain more insight into how these species are being driven by climate change and nutrient pollution. And so this is a picture of some data of the small tortoise shell and how well you've seen trends come across. These are some examples on how I'm going to use this data. So like I mentioned, I try to understand why these patterns change, and using 2 key mechanisms, temperature and host plant quality. And in terms of responses, we know that temperature has profound and direct effects on physiological rates in butterflies, in ectothermic insects, accelerating their growth, accelerating their development. And we know that even moderate warming can cause these range shifts and also affect volcanism. And we know that for these 4 target species that this increase in temperature, but also increase in season length, can cause these species to also start investing in additional generations with or without success, which can then furthermore also influence their success and population trends. So temperature in this case is mainly a direct driver, so it shapes the life cycle and population dynamics of the butterflies itself. But the second mechanism, so the host plant quality, kind of works more indirectly. So when it comes to the host plant, it might sometimes not only be important whether the plant is present, but also the nutritional quality of the plant can be very important for caterpillar, as you can imagine, during development. So plants take up carbon through photosynthesis and other nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus through the soil. And mainly the balance of these elements determines both how fast the plant can grow, but also the nutritional value, which is very important for the organisms that feed on it, like caterpillars. And this balance is called the plant stoichiometry. And as you can imagine, when this balance, this nutritional quality of the host plant is bad or imbalanced, it can have detrimental effects on a species' health and development. And historically, herbivorous insects like butterflies, like the caterpillars that need the plants to eat, nitrogen would be the limiting nutrient. So that would mean that when they're taking up material in order to grow, the more nitrogen they could take up, the better for their development, which is kind of driven. So they would be driven by this nitrogen limitation. But due to the high amount of nitrogen that has entered our systems in recent years, we see that the balance has kind of shifted to the other side. So we're now seeing the effects of an overshoot of nitrogen causing phosphorus limitation and limitation of other macronutrients that species also need to develop and to fully turn into pupa and then turn into butterflies. And in order to test how this host plant quality is doing across Europe, so at the same scale as which you're sampling the butterflies and we're observing the trends of the butterflies, I wanted to sample nettle leaves and soil samples across Europe to actually test, like, okay, how is the elemental composition of these leaves across these monitoring transects. And of course, I would have loved to sample across all locations myself, travel with the van and go around collecting these plants. Unfortunately, due to time reasons and practical reasons, this was not possible. But luckily, there's a huge monitoring network, of course, like there is in the UK, but also in the Netherlands, but in almost all European countries right now. So about a year ago, in April of 2025, I sent out this request for cooperation throughout the monitoring network of the European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. And I asked the coordinators to help me spread the word amongst their network and volunteers to help me collect these nettle and soil samples across their monitoring transect. So if they would go out to monitor butterflies, to also collect a soil sample and some nettle leaves. And I created this protocol and a tutorial video to hopefully ensure that the sampling would be clear and that everyone would do it in similar ways. And I created these sampling kits. So I created these sampling kits. I want to show you this video. It's a short video in which all the materials would be to collect the nettles. And looking back, I calculated how long it would have taken me personally to stamp and to fill and to fold all these parcels. I think it would have taken me 2 or 3 weeks back to back, solely filling these parcels. And in order to make this more fast, but also more fun, I asked my department, I'm working at a really nice department, to help me pack these parcels. I put down some chips and some drinks, and I think within a couple hours, we filled like 400 of these parcels. We were like a little factory making these sampling kits. And in the end, I sent over more than 400 parcels. across the whole of Europe. Amazingly, I got a lot of replies. So a lot of parcels were sent out. I asked people to also take pictures of the locations where they took the samples. But next to that, they also send me pictures of them sampling themselves, or they even sent pictures of their cows, which was a lot of fun to see. In emailing me, they send a lot of information about their sites, the butterflies that they saw, the caterpillars that they saw, how their transects were doing. And also the protocol, with the help of volunteers, was translated to a lot of languages. So I now have a French protocol, an Italian protocol, and Swedish one, and even languages I cannot read. So it was a lot of fun to see all this commitment and enthusiasm of a lot of people. And in the end, a lot of parcels arrived. And I think over 300 samples of about 16 countries. So this is a map of all the samples that have arrived last spring and summer at my desk, and the samples that I've been working on since then. And for the last months, I've been working on analyzing these samples in the lab, so both leaf and soil samples. I've almost finished the analysis of these samples, of both the leaves and so the elemental composition of the leaves and the soil, so that hopefully soon we can analyze and model how this nutritional composition of the nettle plant is distributed across Europe, and hopefully we can also see that whether it's linked to a climatic gradient or a deposition gradient. So I'm very excited to see the results. For this, unfortunately, I cannot give them to you yet, but I'm working on it. It is to be continued. And another way that we're working with this data, or planning to work with this data, is not just on a temporal scale. So the temporal scale is more through the monitoring, to the trend analysis, but also model the relation of these butterflies and their potential drivers spatially. And the way I plan to do this is using species distribution models. And the way this works, so basically you combine these layers of environmental variables with the observation of a species, so that then you can predict based on what variables, what weather conditions, what precipitation data, what land use data, you can expect a certain species somewhere, but also what is driving these occurrences. So this gives us a chance to spatially model the relation between these occurrences and the species and their environment. And the way this works, we'll be choosing these layers, like you can see here, like again, temperature and precipitation, but also land use change or changes in annual temperature, and overlay them with species observations, as you can see here. And now, thanks to this butterfly monitoring scheme, we of course have the observations, but also very importantly, we also have zero measurements. So we have moments that a volunteer, that someone was walking a transect and a butterfly was not seen. It's also very important that you know whether a species was actually absent, or that it was for these predictions to put into these models. And then you can kind of make these predicted maps of where you would expect species. And by doing this for all 4 of our species over multiple years, and we can also include these changing observations over the years, and we hope really to get a better insight in both the temporal, so the trend data, but also the spatial changes in occurrences and how they are changing with their environment. Because we're seeing a lot of changes in these trends, but I'm also very curious to see if we can see changes over European gradient, and then you can also kind of extract to see what are the main drivers in these models. So yeah, next to the modeling and the working on the monitoring data, I'm also rearing caterpillars of the 4 species back in the greenhouse. So last year I reared caterpillars of the small tortoise shell, and under different climatic, like on different temperature regimes and different food regimes, to see how the development of the caterpillars and the development of the pupa, and eventually also the adults and the heat tolerance of the adults, how they respond to these different stressors. And as the new field season is starting, we're hopefully soon going into the field again to set up new tests and experiments and see how these species are doing. And previous year, so in 2025, I did this for the small tortoiseshell, and the years before for the map butterfly and the peacock butterfly. So I very much also hope so to do similar experiments for the red admiral, so that for all 4 species we can kind of see how mechanistically they are responding to these stressors, and see if we can link this to both the trend analysis and spatial analysis, but also to what we're actually seeing in types of responses from the caterpillars themselves. So yeah, that's something about the project that I've been working on. As I mentioned, both on a broad scale, but also trying to in detail understand how these caterpillars are responding. And something that might be nice to add is that about 2 weeks ago, we also had a paper accepted on the effects of different food treatments and temperature treatments on the map butterfly, in which we tried to show how host plant nutrient imbalances can kind of mediate how this butterfly prioritizes size and age at maturity under warming conditions. Yeah, I hope that you found this interesting. If there's any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I think I realized that I turned off my camera about to hold the presentation and then turned it back on the last 2 minutes, but well, it's back on now. Yeah, please let me know if there's any questions. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Berber. It's really interesting. It's great to get that different, wider context as well for the declines that we're seeing in the UK that we heard about from Marc earlier. So there's been some chat about some of the sort of differences between the UK and the rest of Europe around parasitic effects as well. But in terms of your talk, it was so great to see the participation that you had from people and that citizen science aspect of it. And I was just wondering, do you think people got interested in this due to being aware of and worried about the declines, or do you think it was more being able to address a call to action that they were made aware of through your publicity?
Yeah, it's a good question. There was just a lot of enthusiastic responses in general from the network. So I think it's a combination of both, just a lot of enthusiastic people that love to work with butterflies and for butterflies, and I assume love to do this work. And therefore, when a request, we've tried to make the request not too labor intensive. So hopefully it was also an easy way to contribute to something, and maybe also indeed for the fact that we're seeing all these declines, and maybe more people are wondering like what is going on, and if this is a way to at least answer a tiny part of the question, then maybe yes.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I'm sure that the papers and the publicity that comes about after your results are available might increase participation in similar studies in future. So thank you very much for explaining about your research to us. As you've said, any questions into the Q&A or comments in the chat will be available for you to answer as well during the next talk. But I will move us on now. So thanks for your talk, Berber. And we're going to stay talking about wider context for the next talk as well, and movements of butterflies, with something which I think a lot of people are quite excited and interested to hear about, because it's been a hot topic in the media this year, which is about the southern small white. So I will turn to Chris van Swaay, please, to give us some insights into this interesting butterfly and the changes that are happening.
Thanks for inviting me. It's really interesting topic to hear, first of all, about all the developments in the UK on butterfly monitoring. I've been coordinating the butterfly monitoring in the Netherlands for the last 35 years, so I've also my own experience. And one of the exciting things we had last 10 years is actually the coming in of the southern small white Pyrrhus mani. So we'll give a short talk. How can you recognize it? I will show something on the species. I will tell you something about the expansion so far. I'll show you, of course, the situation in the Netherlands. Has it reached the UK? And I will tell you how to prepare yourself to be prepared for the to be able to recognize a species when you see it. So first of all, a very quick overview of the distribution of the whites. This is the small white, Pyrrhus rape. It's a typically more southern species, so you will see it's, I think I can switch on just a second, the laser pointer, yeah. So you see it's missing in the north of Europe. Pyrrhus napi, so the green-veined white is more or less the opposite. It's present all the way up to the north, but it's a bit missing in the south. There are gaps in the distribution there. Pyrrhus brassicated, large white, again, more like the small white, missing in large parts of the very north, but occurring all the way through the Mediterranean. And then, of course, the question is, how can you recognize the small white? Now, this is what we usually say, because in the beginning, we also had trouble in recognizing the butterflies. And what we more or less at the end agree to, because I do a lot of verification, so checking if the photos are the right species, is that we looked at 4 features which have to be, at least 3 of them have to fit. Now, the first and most important one is actually this middle spot. This is almost always clearly bigger than with the small whites. And most important, it's hollow or square, hollow to the back. So this is an important feature. I think maybe even the most important one. But it's variable, like everything with the whites. And this middle spot is connected to the edge by a small black line, or at least there must be some indication of it. The third thing is that the black along the edge goes down further than you see with the small one. I'll show some comparison in the next slide. And another important thing is that this is much more rounded. And because the southern small white is a bit smaller than the small white, and the wings are a bit more rounded, from a distance, it gives you a little bit of the feeling that you see a wood white, which is also small and has much more rounded wings. So it's not, you're not gonna mix it up with the wood white, but it gives you, it's the first thing you see from a large distance. You think it's a bit different, it flies a bit different. And then you start looking for the rest of the features. So this is usually what we do. We say at least 3 of the 4 points should be there, otherwise it's probably a small white. And this is a picture that we made to teach everybody how to do it. So I repeat a little bit. The large white has the black going all the way down. The southern small white has this connection, and at least the black comes to the point where the middle spot is. With the small white, that's never the case. The black ends here. Well, not never. There are some clear examples where it does get a little bit further down. It's a very variable species, very abundant also. And this middle spot is round. And this is more extreme in a green-veined white Pyrrhus napi, where it's clearly rounded. Although there, of course, the black also goes down along the outer edge. So these are the features where you have to take care of when you see it in the field. Now, it's interesting that actually where the adults are relatively difficult to distinguish, the young larvae are not. So this is first and second instar of small white are completely green, and for southern small white have a black head. But this only works in the first two instars. After that, they both look exactly the same. You cannot distinguish them. But this is, of course, something that can help you to see if you have the species in your garden, is to check for young larvae or rear them and check if they have a black head, because that's a very final proof that you have actually this species. So identifying adults requires experience, but you can train yourself. I'll come back to that later. But you can train yourself in identifying whites. There are lots of them around, and you can learn how to identify them. The young larvae are very different, but not the older larvae. And the host plants, there are mainly two species, at least in most of Europe. Central Europe, it's Iberus sempervirens, so candy tuft, and the Protaxis tenuifolia, which sounds a very complicated name, but it's usually grown as rucola, so it's on your pizza, whatever you eat tonight. Rucola means which is grown a lot in allotments in the Netherlands. And you see the photo down right. Of course, most people don't let it come into flower, but the larvae don't need flowers. They need leaves, the same leaves that you want to eat on your pizza. And this is where you can also find quite a lot of larvae and southern small white females hanging around, because given the choice, I have the impression they prefer rucola over candy tuft. So these are the two main food plots. They use others as well, but these are the two main ones. But it's good to remember that you find small whites also on all these food plants. So if you just see a small white hanging around your rucola or around your candy tuft, that doesn't mean a thing, because they also lay eggs on these food plants, and of course they use lots of others as well. But so just seeing something hanging around is not a final proof. Now the expansion of the species has been quite amazing. So this is the map that Ottokar Kudena produced in 2002, and you see it's more or less a Mediterranean species and a little bit in the mountains. That did not change very much 10 years later, in which you see more or less the same distribution, but it has changed in the most recent maps. So this is a map of an atlas we are producing together with Martin Warren and Sam Ellis. This is a map showing the present distribution of the southern small white. It has come up all the way to Kiel in Germany. There is a real population. There's not just one butterfly, but as far as I know, it has not crossed to Denmark at the moment. And for the rest, you can see it's more or less in the Mediterranean, a lot of places. There's another way of showing it, but you can see this is all recent expansion. It's the same data, more or less. And it's also interesting to look back. For example, this is a wonderful book which came out in 1987, showing the butterflies and their habitats in Switzerland. And if you look in this book, you see that the species is described as threatened, and it was not doing very well, and vineyards were taking over the habitat, and only small remnant populations in 1987. So this was not doing very well at that moment. Just a small repetition. We'll keep repeating it. You can see the square middle spot, the connection to the back, around it, back of the forewing, and again a little bit of black here. A typical Pyrrhus mani, a typical southern small white. So it was really very rare in the 1980s, for example, in Switzerland. And this all changed with this paper that actually has a English summary to start with, but it's a small paper on how the sun small white colonized northwestern Switzerland in the summer of 2008. Now, the interesting thing also is that, by coincidence, some people had been collecting periods in 2007 in a small village near Bern, and they had only small whites from the two species. So they were sure there were no southern small whites. In 2008, it was suddenly the most abundant white, small white in this village. So this was the first sign there was something going on. 7 years later, in 2015, the Netherlands was reached. Now, I calculated the distance from Bern to the first spot in the Netherlands. It is 472 kilometers, which were done in 7 years, which means 67 kilometers per year. And this is not a single butterfly, because, of course, red admirals are more mobile, but this is the complete front. So this is butterflies everywhere, just moving, colonizing new sites in a very, very dramatic speed, actually. In the Netherlands, the spread went on more or less with the same speed. So the darker the color, the earlier it was colonized. And you can see that in the southeast. So this part here, this was where the first colonization happened. And then it slowly spread in a few years across the country. It actually has now more or less everywhere, although numbers in the north are a bit lower. But it did reach, for example, the islands in the north, the Frisian Islands, which are also, this is still about 30 kilometers out over open sea, but so they are capable of crossing larger areas of water. It's still good to remember, but though, that real numbers are still relatively small compared to small white. If you see 100 whites in the Netherlands, only about 1% of them generally is southern small white. So it's still the small white and the green-veined white and the large white which dominate the landscape. Typical habitat. So it's a very urban butterfly. They like allotments with rucola, and they like gardens with candy tuft. And this is typically plant you can find today because they are now in flower. This is a typical picture of this time of year. Look at the garden here to the left. You see a large amount here and a large amount here. And gardens like this is where you should look for southern small white. And I'll show later that actually the biggest chance of finding it is when it seems to be that especially the last generation is very mobile. So the late summer generation. But then it's harder to find this candy tuft. So what I would advise, what I did also 10 years ago, and I advise everybody is, take a walk through your village or town, check for good gardens with lots of candy tuft, and at least you know where to check during summer when they are not in flower anymore. So that's a strategy to find the species. When is the good moment? Well, they start flying now. So last week they were already seen. Usually they have the first peak in May, and then a more abundant peak in summer, beginning of July. And then the third peak, third generation, at the end of August, beginning of September. And that's actually the generation where they become very mobile. So that's when females fly long distances through totally through landscapes with no habitat at all, and they just cross it. So you can really bump into them anywhere in the Netherlands, because they are, especially in summer, you just find them also at places with no habitat at all, no food plants. So what happened actually, what caused this? Now, 2008, the person who discovered it, Ziegler, he thought food shortage in southern France after the droughts in 2006. That's what he thought was causing the expansion. Many think, of course, climate change, which looks understandable. But a relatively recent research showed that actually females from the newly established populations have a reduced host plant specialization and an overall increased fecundity. And that's what they think explained the expansion. Because once you start calculating, it means that in a normal population, a female has to generate two adults in the next generation for a stable population. And in this case, to colonize all this big area, it must have doubled or tripled. They must have had much, either they deposited many more eggs or the survival of the eggs to the next generation of adults was much higher. Otherwise, you cannot explain the huge amounts of butterflies which are now to be found in Germany and France and Belgium. Now in the UK, this is the picture of the first specimen, and we can check it to the slide I showed before. You can see there is a very large square middle spot. Well, this is of course a very idealistic. This is what you find a lot. There is a small connection to the back. Of course, here it's a bit more clear. Very rounded back of the wing, even more than in this example. So this is a very good sign. The black on the edge doesn't go that far as here, but altogether it seems it ticks enough boxes to be acceptable. But it's very good to remember small whites can be extremely abundant, and especially in summer, some can look a lot like southern small whites. So you have to be careful. And the photo on itself can be, you never know 100% sure because there is some overlap. If you want to be sure, you have to either find or rear young larvae, because this was a female on the left. So, and you can also see that on many things, but for example, also by the black dots and the shape of this is a male with a very thin abdomen. So actually, you hope that she deposited some eggs somewhere, and that gives you a chance to look for young larvae or rear them. Of course, you can also sequence DNA, but then you have to kill the butterfly, or at least take a small sample, which is very complicated for normal people. So it's an idea to rear young larvae. But it's also important that you train yourself. Now, this is simply a screenshot of observation.org, and you find thousands and thousands of photos of both species, both small white and southern small white, or if you prefer iNaturalist, you can also go to the iNaturalist page and you just type in southern small white and you get thousands of photos, and you can train yourself, you can compare, you can learn, so that when you are at this certain moment that suddenly you think that's a strange white, you know where to look at, you have been trained, you know how you can distinguish the species, what features should I look at, and that is helpful. So thank you. This was my presentation on the southern small white.
Thank you, Chris. Another fascinating talk. I think we've all learnt a lot, and obviously more to learn. So we have got a question that's you did address this towards the end, actually, around the difference between males and females. So is that something that's, again, an additional tricky point about identification that recorders and verifiers are going to need to integrate into their learning that they're embarking upon now that this species is upon our shores?
Yeah, I didn't go into all the other details. Yeah, there is difference between males and females, and there is, which is even more disturbing, a difference between spring and summer butterflies. The spring butterflies, which are flying now, they are quite grey and not so clearly marked as those. I could have shown some spring butterflies, but the summer butterflies, typically the September, the August, September butterflies, which have these very black markings. They are easier, certainly the females. So it's always the females are easy, and was no surprise that this photo from England is a female because they stand out. They are much heavier, black markings, and then everybody thinks that's strange, and that's when you have to start, but you have to be aware that between all these hundreds of small whites, something can be hidden.
Yes, and I was quite struck by your photograph of the sort of typical garden front there. That's really an average home and sort of front
Yeah,
garden there. That presumably that's going to be the sorts of places that we're going to be getting
yeah,
more and more records from on the handy turf, on the wild rocket or the rucola that people might grow there. So we're
yeah.
going to need to keep our eyes peeled, and I suppose do your local experts and your and some of your frequent recorders, do they sort of start to amass their own photographs as a resource, or would you advise, like you said, using some of those national ones?
Yeah, well, I think both happens. Of course, many people in the beginning were very anxious to have it on their Transact. And of course, the nice thing is that the Transacts in urban areas, they were the first ones. So they once they beat all the beautiful nature reserve Transacts. And yeah, you have to learn and you have to practice and you have to be aware that it can happen. And check, yeah, you have to check anyway the whites because of course also the green white and the small white are already quite similar, although compared to the southern small white it's still easy, but yeah, you have to learn, and I think anybody can do it, but it takes some practice.
That is good confidence to be giving us today, and I know lots of people are very excited about the prospect of seeing one, and of course the verifiers are getting clued up already, preparing for that too. So yeah, it's a really exciting thing. I think that we've actually got a meeting after this one with our verifiers as well. So I think it's going to be a topic that we're going to continue to discuss. And I know there's been some comments saying thank you to you personally for the help that you provided to UK verifiers. It just really shows the importance of the UK community being part of a wider community on continental Europe as well, because of the butterflies having the distributions that they do. So thank you, Chris, again for introducing us to our new friend in the UK. And if there are any final questions, if you want to sneak them into the chat, anybody, as I round up the meeting, please do. And we'll do our best to address those now or later. But yes, I think we're finishing on time now. So it just remains for me to say a lot of thank yous. So thank you first to everybody for coming. I can see some of the comments going into the chat as well. I'm glad that you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it very, very much as well. So a big thank you to you all for joining us today. A big thank you to all of our speakers for delivering such varied talks about so many different species, so many different parts of the UK and Europe. Thank you to Richard Austin for single-handedly organising today's event, and we're really grateful for that, as well as your talk, and also for Darren Castle, our IT team member, who's been much needed today. So he was on standby and he was needed. Thank you, Darren. I hope you've all enjoyed the talks, and we do have a feedback form that we usually send out at the end of these. So we will use those comments if you're able to put those into the feedback form. We'll use them to inform future meetings as well. So I hope you're all feeling inspired, as I am, to get out recording. Perhaps you've got a bit of sunshine as well. And it just remains for me to say, on behalf of Butterfly Conservation, thank you for joining us and have a lovely weekend.